Hello and welcome to my channel. This time I'm going to be doing a landscape in pastel, and it's going to be a drawing of a mountain. If you want to see the full video, you should check out my Patreon. I'm going to work on sandpaper. This is 1200 grit sandpaper, a little bit finer than usual. The size is about 9 times 11 inches, but it's the sandpaper that you can buy in hardware stores. It's basically a wet to dry sandpaper. First I'm going to do the sketch of the shape of the mountain with a colored pencil. So I normally work on a 1000 grit. This one is a little bit finer. This one is 1200, so close. But it's not going to make a huge difference. The color of the paper is a little bit lighter. It has a little bit of a texture, but most of it is not going to be visible once I cover it with pastel. Anyway, I'm going to use two types of pastels. I'm going to use soft pastels and pastel pencils. I'm going to use Kohinoor soft pastels and Kohinoor pastel pencils. I started out with some white pastel, and I started putting that down for the clouds because I don't know how the white will appear if I put it on top of the blue layers. So if I want something to be extra bright or extra white, I put down the white pastel first. There's going to be some layering and blending later, but first I put down some clouds where I knew they were going to be. After that I started working with some blue pastel, and for now working around the shapes of these larger groups of clouds which I initially drew with a white pastel. I'm working with metal phthalo blue, and I'm going to cover this whole area. I'm going to draw a few more clouds a bit later, but right now I'm adding a little bit of white on top of that blue because it's a little bit too dark and a bit too vibrant. I want to make it a bit lighter and a bit duller. So I'm putting a bit of white pastel on top of it, and then I'm going to blend these two nicely. So now I'm blending everything together using my fingers. And I'm just going to blend this whole large area in no time. As you can see, blending pastels is very quick and easy, especially on this surface, which allows for multiple layers to mix nicely. Once I've done that, once I've done some initial work with soft pastels, I'm going in with a pastel pencil. I'm going to use this white pencil to draw some smaller shapes, like some finer details, and maybe to refine the shapes of the existing clouds. Add some smaller shapes around their edges, maybe make some of their edges stand out better against the rest of the sky. Basically bring back a little bit of the contrast. And I'm also going to add a few more clouds here at the top and in the middle. I need more clouds. So I'm adding a bit of white pastel and white pastel pencil at the time. Adding a few clouds here and there. I want a bright sunny sky with a few scattered light clouds. So that's the scene that I'm trying to achieve. As you can see, sometimes I leave a cleaner edge against the sky, sometimes I soften it by dabbing on it with my finger to create those wispy, scattered cloud effects. Now once I was happy with the clouds, I moved on to the mountain. The mountain is going to have to stand out against the sky, so we're going to need a clean edge, and I started out by drawing a little bit of that edge with a black pastel, but I'm going to be adding some other colors as well. For this slope here, I started with a little bit of lighter yellowish green and then with some darker green. Here at the bottom of that slope, I'm also going to have some shapes of trees. By the way, the reference will be in the description as usual. And if you have a look at the reference, you will see that there is an interesting contrast between the left side and the right side of the scene, because the right side of the scene is catching some of that warm sunlight. The light is actually coming from the right side. The right side is the light side. The left side is the shadow side, so I'm going to make this slope to the left a little bit darker. Right now I'm using a black pastel pencil to draw some shapes of trees or groups of trees on that mountain slope below that peak of the mountain. The mountain is loosely based, the reference is loosely based on the Stol mountain in Serbia. It's a very interesting shape, and I think I already did a drawing of it, but it was a different season. I think it was an autumn scene. This one is a summer scene, a mountain in summer. So we're going to have some greenish colors. The green is going to dominate here, and of course the bright blue sky. I'm adding a lot of these smaller, darker shapes along the slope of the mountain, and the way that I'm doing this, the way that I'm imitating the appearance of groups of trees, is just by drawing small circular shapes, drawing a circular motion with my pencil and controlling the size of those marks, because the further away something is, the smaller it's going to appear. So the canopies and the objects which are very far away are going to appear smaller. The side of the mountain here is going to be a little bit darker than the sky, but I started out with some light ultramarine. This color is a little bit cooler than the color that I used for the sky. It has a bit more of a reddish component to it, and it's going to make for a nice shadow color. At the top of the mountain, I want a dull greenish color with some darker details here and there, but I want it to be lighter than the side of the mountain, and I want it to be a bit duller because the grass up there at the top is going to be mostly shorter and drier, and some parts of that rocky terrain is also going to be completely bare. But the thing is that I'm using a black pastel pencil every now and then to go over some of these lighter layers, to add either a little bit of texture or to make the existing colors a little bit darker, because I want the whole shape of the mountain to stand out against the sky. This is very important because I need the shape of the mountain to stand out in contrast against the lighter background. If I don't achieve that contrast, it won't look very convincing, because the light is coming from above, and the sides of the mountains definitely need to be darker, and the entire mountain needs to be darker, at least a little bit darker, but I would say quite a bit darker than the sky and the clouds behind it, because those are very light shapes. So here I'm drawing some suggestions of smaller shapes on that side of the mountain to indicate the rocky terrain there, rocky shapes there. So I'm drawing some indications of rocks and cracks and things like that. So basically making a bunch of smaller marks to try to make this look like more like the side of a mountain. And I just keep adding those smaller rocks and cracks, and every now and then I go back in and I add a little bit of that light ultramarine blue color, bluish color, because that whole part of the mountain is in the shadow, so this is a nice shadow color. It has a little bit of a bluish, cooler tone to it. Also notice that, as I've already mentioned, my paper has a little bit of a texture. It's not plain grey. So I'm kind of going to use that texture for the stone, because it's going to make the stone look more detailed, more interesting. So I'm not going to cover it thoroughly, I'm not going to cover it entirely, even though I will shade it and add a few layers on top, but here and there I will allow a little bit of that texture of the sandpaper to break through or to show through, making the side of the mountain, that rocky side of the mountain, a little bit more interesting. So here I'm just shading the side of the mountain a little bit more with a black pastel pencil, because I need it to be a bit darker. I realized that it just didn't have enough value in order to stand out against that background. It was a little bit too light. So now I'm just going over it gently, trying not to spoil the existing shapes and just adding a little bit of shadow and value overall. This entire grassy green area at the foot of the mountain, this valley here, is going to be covered with this darker green. But I'm going to mix in a little bit of this lighter yellowish green here and there as well, especially here on the right side. So remember what I said, if you look at the reference, you will see that one part of the mountain here on the right is catching a little bit of that warm sunlight. So I want to capture that in my scene as well. So I'm going to shade the right side of this slope and give it a little bit of that lighter color. I'm going to add a little bit of that darker color, a little bit of black pastel in the shadow area of the mountain, which is to the left. And then once all of that is ready and blocked in, I'm just going to blend with my finger until I get everything to be smooth and blended in nicely. And I'm going to add the details and the textures a little bit later. So as you can see, now we already are beginning to see a little bit of that contrast which I intended to achieve, with the left side being the shadow side, being a little bit darker and cooler as well, and the right side being a bit warmer and lighter because it's more exposed to the sunlight, it's more exposed to the light source. Now I'm drawing some smaller shapes here with the black pastel. I'm adding some smaller trees on this slope to the left, and I'm going to be adding a bunch of these smaller shapes. Pastels, of course, are a pleasure to work with when it comes to landscapes, because you don't need much precision, and it's easy to use a variety of colors and to mix them and to cover large areas. You can even go for somewhat larger pieces and still make them look fairly detailed. I keep adding some more trees here on this slope. They are getting a little bit larger, as you can see, because some of them are going to vary in size a little bit. Some of them are going to be a little bit smaller, others a little bit larger, but generally the more we get closer to the foreground area, to our viewpoint, the larger the shapes are going to appear, obviously, because they're closer to our viewpoint. So this tree that I'm drawing here is a little bit larger than the ones which are further back, and the ones which are all the way back at the slope of that mountain, just under that peak. These are just tiny, barely discernible shapes. They look like just like a mass of trees, a bunch of trees, and occasionally I will leave a little bit of lighter space between them to indicate like maybe there are some parts of that slope which aren't covered with trees, or maybe, you know, these are some tops of those canopies which are catching a bit of light from above, whichever. But as you can see, I will just keep adding these smaller shapes and adding a little bit of shadow at the bottom to the left, because in order for me to integrate them into the scene, they need to have a little bit of shadow under them. The light source is coming from above, but it's also coming a little bit more from the right. So each of these smaller shapes is going to be casting a bit of shadow from right to left, as you can see. And whenever I draw a tree like the one that I'm drawing here in the foreground, which is a little bit larger than the one behind it, obviously, I'm going to make sure that I add a little bit less of that black pastel at the top and a little bit more at the bottom. And also, sometimes the pastel pencil picks up a little bit of that light pastel dust, so I need to clean up the tip of it every now and then in order for me to be able to produce those really dark, deep shadow tones. And here I'm going to add a few more trees, but I'm going to vary the shapes a little bit. This one is going to be a bit more elongated, maybe a little bit more of a cylindrical shape. So I just want to have a little bit of randomness and variety, adding some more and more shapes of trees so that they wouldn't be lonely. As Bob Ross would say, everybody needs a friend. Well, my trees here have lots of friends. And some of these are smaller friends like bushes maybe, or maybe some smaller younger trees. I don't know which they are. I'll leave that to the interpretation of the viewer. But I need to fill this foreground area with some smaller shapes, with some details of interest. So I have this group of trees in the middle, in the foreground, like a cluster of trees. But here in the back, I started drawing the outline of some groups of trees because I want to shade above them and around them so that the top part of the canopies would remain lighter. This is very important because I want the viewer to be able to discern at least some smaller shapes within that larger group of trees. I don't want it to look like a large blob of trees where the viewer can't really make out individual canopies. Of course, when you look at a group of trees at the distance, it will feel, because of all the foliage, like all the canopies are merging into one shape. But, you know, you can still see some of the shapes bulging out or standing out. And that's what I want to achieve. So some of these shapes will be standing out and they will be catching a bit of light from above because they're protruding, because they're sticking out. Other parts will be in the shadow, so those will just be a bit darker because they're further away from the light source. I know that I've done quite a long series of charcoal drawings on my channel, and I wanted to mix it up a little bit, so I've had a color pencil drawing and now a couple of pastel landscapes, and I hope that you'll like them. Here I'm adding a bit of this lighter yellowish green, because some of these canopies will be catching some of that warm light. I want to add a little bit more of that lighter green just to make sure that these canopies will really stand out against the rest of the foliage, against the rest of the trees. So I'm just going to continue working on this group of trees until I get it to look the way I want it to, and until I fill in the rest of that part of the scene with trees. And in order to do that, you need a little bit of patience. You can't just make long, broad strokes from side to side. You need to make tiny circular motions back and forth, and circular motions. You need to also vary the shapes a little bit, kind of make it a little bit random, so that it would look like actual foliage as seen from a distance. Because when you look at foliage and trees at the distance, you will see a bunch of greenish, lighter and darker shapes. So that's basically what I'm trying to achieve. But in between those shapes, I will always add a little more shadow in some places to make some of those individual shapes stand out, so that the viewer could discern individual shapes or individual trees. And I think that you can already see the beginnings of that. So it's not just like a group of foliage, it's a group of trees where some of these smaller shapes stand out a little bit. I keep adding some smaller details to the side of the mountain as well, deepening some of these cracks and maybe adding a little bit more shadow to the side of the mountain, so that I would achieve a little bit more contrast maybe. And then just finishing the rest of the canopies here on the right. Like I said, these need to be brighter in color, they need to be lighter green, I can add a little bit more shadow to the left, because all of these shapes are casting a bit of shadow to the left, to the part of the slope which is facing away from the light source. Now I'm just going to finish the scene by adding a few more smaller shapes here and there, like maybe some tiny clumps of grass or some smaller bushes and trees here and there scattered across that slope, just so that it would look maybe a bit more interesting. And I'm also going to add a touch of light ochre, some yellowish colors here and there, so that we would have a little bit more variety in that grassy terrain, maybe a little bit more variety in color. Just adding a few more smaller shapes here and there with a black pastel pencil, and I'm almost done. I also added a little bit of shadow here and there in the foreground, like maybe that shadow is coming from some other trees, it doesn't really matter. I put my signature on the left side, and now the drawing is done. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and for longer videos check out my Patreon. Bye bye.